Thanks, Pete. Yeah. All right. I'm gonna try to do a sound check. Can everybody hear me all the way in the back? Otherwise, I'll have to talk into this microphone like this the whole time. So we're all good? So all right, cool. So first of all, I'd like to say thank you for coming out to listen to me. Hopefully it'll be less than the amount of time it'll take for you to get bored. And with art and tech, it's nice to be able to get a chance to talk about a little bit of the tools and the work that I've embraced to help create new ideas. So, all right. So first off, I'll just kind of set it up by saying I'm going to introduce myself and then dive in a little bit on the topic for a while. And then afterwards, we'll, if anybody has any questions, I'll do my best to answer to the best of my knowledge. So let's get into it. Let's go. All righty. So about me, my name's Dustin. I'm an artist, but I would better describe myself as a creator. And what that means is that I tend to use the written word, illustration, and animation to create new ideas. And in my work, I've gone as far as working in various disciplines, but I found myself at a place where I've been able to put together new concepts and package them and pitch them, and I actually got an opportunity to pitch a project for a graphic novel series and was picked up for 3 books. And I just kind of wanted to share a bit of information and highlight some things that I do to create new ideas. And to a great degree, that's considered world building. And world building is a process that writers tend to use to create the context for the worlds in which their stories live. There's no one way to world build. You can pretty much just use a piece of paper and write out all of your ideas, or you can build models. You can do pretty much anything. But in my process, I have embraced like using a lot of kind of like different digital tools to create worlds. Even though on the end, I work in a very traditional format of like the book, I kind of use non-conventional ways to get to the page. And a lot of that began with early childhood. Like I have drawn my whole life. Like the first thing I ever drew was a turtle, and I was probably barely even 3 years old. It was just something my mom taught me how to do. And since then, it just kind of sparked something in me that I could take ideas in my head and just make them real. And it just became an obsession. And like a bunch of kids in the 80s, I was drawing dinosaurs and Thundercats and Ninja Turtles. And then eventually, like I drew so much of that stuff that my mom was like, you need to draw something that's your own idea. And I'm not putting up any more Ninja Turtles on the refrigerator. And that was a challenge that actually sparked me to think about how to create new ideas, how to tell stories, but then how to do it in a way that was like real. And it kind of led me on this path of becoming a creator. And I was like really inspired by animators and like filmmakers. And I just thought it was like so fascinating that you can make new things that didn't even exist before. And you could tell these stories, and you could create these worlds that could turn into pretty much anything, all the way down to you could make a theme park. So that basically gave me the motivation to pursue an arts education. And I was fortunate enough to actually get the support to do that. And that was like just an early sort of kind of drive for me, all the way to like even going to arts high school and ultimately being able to attend a really great arts institution post high school which was Rhode Island School of Design, also kind of commonly known as RISD. And I actually was a part of the animation and film program there, where being someone that was, like, I grew up in Memphis, Tennessee. There's like a lot that I just was not necessarily exposed to culturally or creatively, even though I had a very strong support system. Being able to go into an environment where you're meeting young artists from every part of the world you could think of, but you also have professors that pretty much have their own successes in their own careers, but they're sharing and imparting new ideas upon you. It takes you from a place of kind of appreciating creative work from an aesthetic place, but the fundamentals of like why aesthetics have value, why certain objects function in the real world, and why things have kind of cultural context, and it gives you the ability to ask those questions. And in being able to do that, it kind of unlocks something in you as a creator where you can appreciate something, but you also have the context where you begin to try to understand something, not just for yourself, but for like other people. And I think that kind of educational foundation at that age kind of gave me a broader sense of like what it was to be an artist. So the ideas of just being an illustrator, or you can be an animator, you can be a graphic designer, those were sort of skill sets and tools, but what are you doing? Like what are you making? So that kind of like really began to build the core foundation of me saying, not just an artist, I'm a creator. So today, in speaking about world building, a lot of what I do for my own work is informed by that. It's informed by early experiences, and it's informed by trying to make things that actually spark that in other people and kind of give real context to the work that I make. And in doing that, I tend to like to use a variety of tools to get there. So let's start with an idea that I had 5 years ago. I'm going to use my own work as a context to talk about world building. And 5 years ago, I was in a place in my career where I've worked on a lot of different things. I came here after college, and I got a chance to start my professional life as an animator for Cartoon Network. And I've had experiences where I would work on highly technical work for like corporate outfits and things like that, but I wasn't really making anything new. The thing that I wanted to do since I was a little kid, I wasn't having that experience. And a lot of people in their artistic career tends to go through highs and lows. You go through peaks and valleys. And sometimes when you're in the valley, you don't know when that next peak is coming. And it could come in the form of an offer to work on a project, or in my case, I had to offer myself to work on a project with no idea of where the destination might lead, but it felt good. And at that time, 5 years ago, my wife now, but she was not my wife then 5 years ago, we spent a lot of time just kind of discussing ideas, and we go on these walks and hikes in nature and everything like that. And one thing we both have a great love for is Hayao Miyazaki, like the Japanese director that made Spirited Away and Princess Mononoke and My Neighbor Totoro. Like, we love his work. And she kind of gave me a challenge, kind of like the same way my mom did. She was like, what if you made something like that? And I'm like, whoa, I don't make, I don't do that. And she was like, no, like make something from that same spirit, where you take your own cultural experiences and kind of paint with a broader brush and a deeper palette and kind of create a new world in that way. And that was a challenge. You know, sometimes that's all it takes is just a question, like, what if, you know, things like that. So something about that stuck within me, and it made me think of an idea of, I had the image of a boy that builds a flying machine and flies across the valley to save his homeland. Something as simple as that got the ball rolling, and that became the genesis for Kudzu. And in that process, I created something that was new for me. And I'd like to share with you the foundations of the mythology of Kudzu and the world that he comes from. And from there, we'll talk about some of the tools that I use to help create the visual language for it. So, Kudzu's world is our own world. However, Kudzu's story doesn't necessarily begin in the future. It begins in the past. It begins with us. And it begins with a planet that has changed. And a conflict that took over the whole world to the point where human beings nearly destroy it and trigger a flood. And in that flood, it brings about a new age. And for a period of time, after 1,000 years, land does return. And not only land, people. Many people. People who could foresee an Earth that was changing and prepared by building life pods to survive the calamity. And they found a new green land and a very different Earth. In many ways, an Earth that has been healed, but also an Earth that's born on top of the ruins of the past. But in this Earth, there are guardians. Once thought of as being creatures from mythology and lore, but they're actually protectors of a planet in the times of transition. And not only do they protect the Earth in times of transition, they protect the great power source that's within the Earth. And at this time, they entrust this new man with this new power. And with this power, mankind flourishes once again, bringing light back into the world. And they live in harmony and peace. However, something old from the past, from the wars, remains. And the power is not secured. And there's a new threat, which happens to also be an old threat, which are weapons that can never be destroyed nor turned off. And that's the mythological foundation of Kudzu. It tells a story of our world in the future, which is nearly destroyed, and then people flourish again, like all things happen. However, this kind of massive artificial intelligence system is still in operation, and now they have to basically fight for the future against something from the past. So that's the foundation of Kudzu. And it's a really broad world. It's got like a mix of like fantasy elements, and then you have sci-fi elements, and then it has this nature and anti-war allegory. So there's like a lot of visual cues to it and a lot of narrative cues to it that require me as a creator to like highlight that, to create it, to like define it, and actually give it context. So for me, like I work primarily digitally. So I have a computer, I have drawing tablet, I even use some VR stuff to create some of this stuff. Even though, like I said, it ends up in the final form of a book, I tend to like to use these tools to help me visualize it, to give me context to the space and these objects and things like that. So let's get into a little bit of like what that means. So my main character here is Kudzu, and he has like this cool adventuring outfit that he wears. And it makes for an appealing character, but for me as a creator, it has narrative context. It's not just, armor bits and shoes and everything like that. For me, I'm thinking about the narrative behind these things. It tells a story about his past, or the past of the world that he comes from. So I like to talk about that. And like all things, my work starts on paper. It starts very loose and gestural. These are scans from my sketchbook. And so when I'm thinking about these things, I write and I figure this stuff out visually. Like I'll think about like, what do human beings do for like these hibernation chambers and things like that. I'm thinking about like, what does armor, or basically the items that like fighters in World War III would wear, because they'll rapidly advance in terms of technology. And it's different people from all over the world. So they're gonna handle, using and then repurposing equipment. Like, what does that look like? So for me, all of these things begin as like pencil sketches and ink work and watercolor, and it's really loose. But it kind of allows me to kind of like take this bundle of ideas and kind of start to put them on the page. And from there, I'll take a few sketches. So from there, I'll take something like a rough sketch for some armor. And it's probably hard to see right now, but once lights go down, we'll be able to see it. Like I'll actually begin to sculpt this concept out in a software called ZBrush, which is designed for digital sculpting. And it just allows me to kind of like dimensionally create this thing where I can kind of see it from multiple angles. And that gives me a better sense of like the form that I'm working with as an illustrator. And to work that way, it gives me a reality. Because sometimes you want to work from a real place. And sometimes if you're imagining something that's not real, it's good to make it real for yourself. You can use reference material. You can work from a lot of variety of sources. But for me, like I tend to like to use 3D tools to help sculpt and define these things. Something like this, even though it's armor, and it aesthetically fits within the world I'm creating. For me as a storyteller, I see this and I see the armor that's designed for people to interface with machines. So there we go. So if you have a variety of like human-machine interfaces in which you have to get into like a robot, a person controls that, and you have multiple people that need to do it. My thought process behind that is that if you come up with a standard suit that already has the ability to hook up and interface with a machine, multiple people can wear it and jump in and out. And it also functions as body armor as well. So from that context, like I begin to think about how do I create that, for the characters, because when I design a character, their clothing and the things that they have on their body has context to the narrative of the world that they're in. So being able to highlight that with bringing a sketch into software and kind of figuring that out and beginning to sculpt these objects out and see them in 3 dimensions, it allows me to have like my own reference point and to kind of create a reality for myself to work from. So when I go from ZBrush to a ZBrush sculpt, I can bring it into another software called, this is open source software called Blender, and then I can apply more colors and more context to it. And I actually have a 3D object that's a reference point, so if I'm drawing a page, I have a solid reference from multiple angles for that particular object. As you can see there as well too. Something as simple as a boot. Like I'll sketch it out, I'll draft out a 3D version in sculpt mode, and then I have a boot reference that's readily available for me. And these different objects and items have the ability to kind of like enhance and solidify a narrative. And then we'll jump into something like these robotic creatures that, for me, by the time we get into Kudzu's story, they're kind of like these near organic like machines that function off a little bit of biomimicry and are programmed to basically continue to fight this war. But if you advance it and push the evolution of something like that to a great degree, like in my mind, I'm envisioning something that actually has nearly like an insect-like creature, even though the core of it is inorganic and completely mechanical. So I'll do sketches, but in conjunction with sketches, I actually will draft out some of the frameworks of these creatures in three-dimensional software. And I've even adopted using virtual software that's actually VR-based, where I can begin to build these creatures in a virtual physical space. And it allows me to kind of recreate a certain form of scale in one-to-one relation to like my physical scale. So like if I want to draw out this little creature like that and kind of come up with a basic skeleton, I can actually scale it up to 12 feet high and actually physically see this thing within that context. And it gives me a sense of being able to think about how like my characters relate to those things. And I can further iterate on top of it and figure out form language and things like that, just using 3D applications and tools to kind of further enhance that relationship to something that's not tangibly real. This even can apply to something as simple as the village that Kudzu lives in, the main character. His home being Shade Tree, a really like idyllic place to grow up in. And using virtual software for painting, like I can actually physically draw out this place. And so some of the ideas that I dream about, like I can take that and give myself a virtually physical reference for it. And this is a software called Quill, which is available through the Oculus platform. And then I end up creating like a 3D model conversion of something that does not exist. And this is a reference that I can then use for drawing or fully realizing and rendering. And I could actually pan the camera around in the scene as well and actually figure out sightline and different things like that. So some of these tools for like a creator, an artist, expand your ability to speak and define your own vision. Even though for me, I began on the page. I began on the sketchbook, and I used the digital tools to refine and enhance something that begins from a very simple place. And this is sort of a grab of like pretty much my core work set. Like I use Blender. All my illustration and the final form goes through Clip Studio and Adobe software. But these other tools I use heavily just to kind of develop basically the constructive minutia that gives me my own self-generated reference point. ZBrush for digital sculpting, Oculus and Quill for three-dimensional painting. I forgot to add the other logo, which is actually also use Google's software called, what is that software called? It is called Tilt Brush. And that's another digital three-dimensional painting software that actually is like very useful. So the world of Kudzu, and some of the tools I use to get there and to create that world for myself. And Kudzu is actually, the first graphic novel is due out later this year. It's called Kudzu, Heart of the Mountain, and it's going to be available from publisher Boom Studios, comic book stores, bookstores nationwide. And it's pretty much a dream of mine to get to this place as a creator, to have the ability to tell a story on this scale and about these types of characters in this way. And I hope to see what ultimately will come of them once it's beyond my own control and kind of gets in the hands of other people, and see what happens next. I'm also beginning live stream of my work as I work on illustrations and stuff. I do live stream on Sundays at 8 p.m. on YouTube. And that live stream actually is more reflective of what I do in terms of the variety of software and tools that I use to kind of develop concept work for Kudzu and sometimes for other projects. And I just like to say thank you for allowing me to share a little bit of what I do and some of the tools that I use as, I'm working on the process of building my own world. And that's it. All right. Good.
Awesome. Thank you, Dustin.
Okay.
So we're actually going to transition into 15 minutes of Q&A. So Dustin, I will hand you the mic.
Oh, okay. Cool. Hello. All right. So if anybody has any questions, feel free. No question. Oh.
So at the beginning of the talk, you mentioned that you thought about incorporating elements of your culture into the world.
Yeah.
The way that Princess Nokia made these references along with these kind of big political ideas.
Oh, yeah.
So what elements were culturally a component in this story, and then what elements were more of a political component?
Oh, okay, cool. All right, so she asked, what are some of the cultural elements? Now, on the world building side, I didn't get into that in terms of thematics. I was just really kind of talking about some of the tools I use. Kudzu, I would say the title itself, a lot of people kind of get tripped up on that, but that'll give you context to the way that I'm working here. So the main character here, his name is Kudzu. Now, when I titled the character Kudzu, a lot of people were like, why? What does that have to do with anything? It's a plant that most people are trying to get out of their yard for the most part. The history of Kudzu plant in the United States, particularly in the Southeast, is that it was a plant from Japan that was brought over here and sold to be a cash crop. A lot of farmers bought it and they planted it and they couldn't get rid of it. It grew far too much. It took over everything. And it came from being a cash crop that was going to be sold and you can make a bunch of money off of it to being a nuisance. And it's very hardy. It's hard to kill. And I just love the idea of giving a character that name, especially a character of this young black kid. Because I think culturally, that's what he is. He was something brought over to be used. Now he's no longer useful. Now he's a nuisance, but it's hard to kill. It's more of a poetic resonance in that sense. So that kind of speaks to sort of the themes that I'm working with this particular book. But on the larger context, it's a world in which the meek inherit the earth. And it's a world of what does that look like? What happens when the least of us have a chance to define the world? And what happens when they have to contend with some of the harsher realities of the past? And so that is kind of told through the sort of metaphor of these warring robotic machines that are more representative of a machine of order that we have today. And sort of what these people will have to do to contend with that and sort of make peace with nature in order to have the power to basically challenge that and exist in a more peaceful world. So that's the core theme of Kudzu. And that, for me, is inherently rooted in the culture of people that I come from. You know, in the American South, like black people in the South have had to define themselves against a very harsh environment and a very, very tough past. So being able to write a story on that sort of thematic ground, but do it in a way where it's very engaging and very just exciting and kind of works with a completely different visual language that's not necessarily always used to tell these types of stories, is pretty exciting, and it's for kids. I think it offers a little bit of a change of pace and gives us a chance, gives me a chance to speak to things that I really value. So visually, how does that connect to sort of like the visual elements that I work with? Something as simple as, I'll go back to the main splash. Something as simple as Kudzu's hair, Birdie's hair, his mom's hair, you know, things like that. Like, to me, being able to kind of create characters that actually have hair that's natural to them, and it's subtle, but it has resonance and power in terms of being able to see something new and something different. Kudzu has like dope little sneakers, you know. I just kind of imagine, like, it's just kind of crazy to me. It's like, yeah, he's all in his crazy future, but he's still like got dope sneakers. It's just something like that just makes me feel pretty good, and I like depicting that. Simple things just resonate in terms of like being able to connect. I tend to like the subtle reference more so than the very direct on the nose things. Sometimes they're just references that make sense to me personally. Maybe other people might interpret it differently. So I don't know if that helps answer the question.
Yeah.
All right. Yes.
I was wondering about your process when you're going from 3D back to 2D.
Yeah.
Is it reference only, or do you actually, like, through lighting, actually use part of the...
Very good question. So she asked, how do I incorporate using the 3D in the 2D work? Okay, so a lot of what I'll actually do on the page is it's primarily first party reference, which is like self-reference that I create with the 3D work. Sometimes I use 3D just because I get bored with drawing and I just want to do something, kind of break out of the same process. But to directly speak to the reference, this object up here, it's a 2D drawing that I actually first built in 3D. And because it's kind of a mechanical thing that has like specific parts in a certain type of dimension, I tend to like to build that in 3D and then pose it and then redraw it in 2D. But it gives me an ability to kind of maintain the proper shape language, and then it doesn't get out of whack. So like if we see it in different angles on the page, it actually feels consistent. Sometimes you could draw something 1,000 different ways, and then you kind of lose the specificity, especially in like mechanical or very defined objects like that. So that would be like a direct 3D reference. But I try to draw it in such a way so that it doesn't look like a trace, because sometimes you could do a 3D object and you trace directly on top of it, and it looks too stiff and it doesn't fit with anything else in this scene. There's also, I do a process of drafting out things like certain parts of the landscape in 3D so that when I'm picking sight lines for certain portions on the page, like I'm just basically referencing something that has a real physical relationship to its, to different parts of itself. So I definitely do that, but ultimately my goal is to create a finished hand, even though it's digital, it's an illustration by hand and it has the right look and feel. All right, anything else?
You focused a lot on the visuals. How do you go about doing the character development with all the people?
Oh, character development. Character development is something that, unless I'm referencing somebody in my own life, I go through a process of basically character exploration, where if I have an idea for a character, depending on sort of the role they play, I try to kind of come up with a kind of a basic framework of kind of like their physical dimension, like especially if a character's like, let's say for instance, like one of my favorite characters is Kudzu's mom here. She's a warrior, right? Wish I brought more, more visual. This is slides pulled together for this presentation, but even though I try to like make sure that she looks physically like someone who's ready for battle. So she's not meant to look like her body type is athletic. So in that, I want to make sure that that looks believable. Even though she's a cartoon character, she should have a certain kind of sense of muscle tone and everything like that. And she's also like a person that's a very particular like ethnic type. So you want to make sure it fits in line with kind of making sure that that's believable as well. So those considerations are always brought into how to define a character. So from there, it's kind of easy to flesh that out, because it's like you can easily think like, well, if I were to think of like a real life person that she could be, I would think of a person that kind of fits that, and I kind of use that as a starting point for them. The style of Kudzu is very kind of like stylized in terms of the faces and stuff like that. So there's a point in which it does not necessarily look realistic, but there's a balance between a little bit of trying to stay true to life, but then kind of like stylizing it and refining it.
How long did it take you to, like, what was the process like in developing this, and how long did it take you to actually do it?
Oh, okay, cool. So process. Okay, so I started this like in 2005. And where I am today, so I think, what was, you remember, how long ago did I, okay, so I'll walk you through that. So, okay, so I started in 2005, like literally like at the beginning in 2005. I didn't know what I was gonna do with it. I just had the initial idea and I started drawing the basic constructs of the world, I figured out the main character, and then I started writing sort of like the overall sort of big picture view in the plot. And that summer, there was a publisher that I really liked that actually opened up something they never do. They were taking open submissions for new work, for creator-owned work. And the submissions were due by the end of July. So I started in the beginning of 2005. And so I was like, okay, I'll just use that submission date to work on this project. My goal wasn't necessarily to get picked up for publishing. I literally was just using it as a goal to finish something that I was having fun working on. And I did a 16-page sample comic. I wrote a really kind of probably like a 3-paragraph brief about it. And I kind of packaged that up. The comic is fully finished. It's like 16 pages, beginning to end. It doesn't really do anything other than highlight what the world looks like, and kind of has a very kind of non sequitur story. But I was like, all right, cool, I finished something. I was just happy to get something of my own work done. and I submitted in July. And I think by the end of August, I got a response from them, and I was not anticipating any particular response. They said, your artwork's really good, but the story isn't there. And I was like, wow, that's pretty amazing, because I didn't think I would hear anything. And it led to me having at least one contact with an editor at that particular publisher. They're called Oni Press. They're based out of Portland. And I love the work they put out. And I thought that was so cool that like I got a great, to me that was maybe was a great response, you know, because I had never gotten that before. And I was pretty much kind of committed to the story. And I was like, can I repitch you guys? I'm going to work on the story a little bit more because I literally didn't think I would hear anything from anybody. And this is kind of brand new. And they said, sure. Just resubmit it if you want to. And I took a year and I wrote a stronger story. I just committed to saying, you know what, I don't care how long it takes. I'm gonna write something that if I had to work on it for a long time, I want it to be something that I really, really, really valued. So I took a year, and a year later, so 2016, I resubmitted. And I was given a book offer after just really kind of like committing to making something stronger. And I got a book offer in the fall of 2016, and I did not sign that book offer because there were some holdups because I was waiting to get a couple of contract details worked out. And it took like 6-7 months. And in that 6-7 months, I ended up meeting some other people in the comics industry during that time. And I was kind of encouraged to take the work to another publisher. And 6 months after that, like I was fed up with the amount of time it was taking. I think they just wanted me to sign the original contract. I didn't really like the contract the way it was, some terms I didn't agree with. And so I took it to another publisher at the beginning of 2017. And it took all of like 2 hours, and I was given an offer for 3 books. From the time that the head of that publisher actually received my pitch package for this project. So it took 2 years to get to a 2-hour decision. So I was given an offer before I was given an official offer. And that following Monday, like I pitched to my editor, and actually I got an offer for publishing, and then I pitched to my editor, and I started running my mouth about everything that happens after book 1 and then this, and then I got a 3-book offer. That's how that happened. Because I got really excited. And so I ended up getting a 3-book offer, and then like I ironed out some stronger terms for myself, and a month later I signed, and then it was like, all right, now you got to write all this stuff. I got to write 3 books. And so I got to writing, and after 2 or 3 editors later, we're down to this year, and I have a bunch of pages to draw for the first book. So the first one's due out this year, and it's kind of a crazy journey. It's like if you had asked me like 5 years ago, would I be doing this, and you told me it was going to take 5 years, I probably wouldn't have started. You know, it really was really kind of like a shot in the dark. Like I had no plans of getting to this point. Like I literally was just working on something that, for me, it meant a lot to me. And I just happened to send it to somebody else and ask, what did you think?
You said 2005, you meant 2015.
I said 2005? Oh, yeah, 2015. Ah, yeah, okay. It's all the same to me. So right now in 2010, so we're 2010 now. No, yeah. Oh, I'm sorry.
Well, you kind of answered it, actually.
Oh, okay, cool. All right. Anything else, or are we all wrapped up? Okay. Oh, there's one more.
Are all the assets you create from
Yeah, you can actually. That's actually the fun part about it. So, um, it's fairly easy to do it. Like they kind of like interoperate between each other. So do you work with any 3D software at all?
No, not right now.
Okay, so so Blender is kind of like, think of it as like, Blender's open source, so anybody can download it and learn how to use it and make their own work with Blender. It's actually really, I love that software. It's completely free. It's pretty powerful. It's a little difficult to learn, but it actually, if you get a chance to kind of dive into it, there's a lot of resources on YouTube that you can learn it. I'd say it probably take like 3 months to get a good working knowledge of it. And you can pretty much make anything. If you want to make like a lot of stuff that I do is kind of sketchy, like even on the 3D side, I don't finish anything in 3D. I just use it to create self-reference. And you can kind of like you said, you can interoperate between the different apps, and you can export out of Blender into the VR software, and you can take something you make in VR and bring it into Blender and work with it that way. It's really, you can pretty much make anything. It's something I really like. Eventually I'd like to do something in like a finished 3D film or something like that. Right now I got much more work to contend with, but it's super dope. All right.
Does Quill have enough kind of like detail that you can apply to where it's something you could use in Blender? Or do you have to kind of clean it up a little bit?
Yeah, you gotta clean it up a lot in Quill. So Quill is kind of like, let me go back to this. So this would be like Quill, right? So it looks like it looks kind of more flat shaded and kind of cartoony, and you're just kind of like creating these lines in space. There's not there's some articulation, but there's not a lot of things you can do with it in Quill. But when you do export it, you could either, it looks like this, right? Where it's kind of got artifacts and stuff that you don't necessarily always want, but you can change the material properties and apply different shaders to it, and you can work with it. For me, it's more like a fast reference tool. So, but you can make final work with it. And if you animate in Quill, you can export the animation and bring it into Blender, and it will play back. And it's actually kind of cool. So, all right. One more question, if there is one. No?
So the level of detail is the triangulation and stuff when you create like a Blender or ZBrush. Like, do you have to be particular about the order that you create the detail level?
Oh, okay. Okay, so that's like, that's a question about resolution between the apps. Okay, so, all right, so there's 3D resolution. Everything is kind of like made with like quads and tris, which are just like these little, sometimes you see the little lines in 3D where it's like a little cage. Like the more dense the lines are, where it's like more squares you have, the more higher resolution that mesh is, and the less you have, the more low res that mesh is. You actually, Quill has one kind of you don't really have control over the mesh density when you export out of Quill. But when you do export out of Quill and put it in Blender, you can actually apply more density to that mesh. And then in ZBrush, it's like, within ZBrush, you're working beyond 3 million squares, so to say, that's the way I could translate it. But you can't do that in Blender. You have to like reduce that count down and then make it more manageable inside of Blender. So you pretty much have control in ZBrush and you have control in Blender. Quill, you don't have any control. All right.
Everyone thank our lovely speaker.